So I added on some notes here off to the side that we're going to go through because we're going to need these to be able to do. So first of all, complex numbers are numbers that have part of it that's real, part of it that's imaginary, and you cannot combine the two because they're not like terms. One has an I, one doesn't. So the overall rule is while you're doing these, treat the I just like an X. All right, treat the I just like an X because that's how it works in terms of adding things together, multiplying, and doing things like that. All right, so there's some examples of complex numbers. Technically, a complex number is supposed to have the real part first and the imaginary part second, and the I is supposed to come after the number, and that's important when you have something like this. All right, because earlier when we did this stuff, we tended to write 2I radical 4. That's technically not correct. It technically should be 2 radical 4, and the I should come last. Full disclosure, I'm not marking you off for that. Okay, on the Regents exam, if somebody tried to, I would argue hard that they shouldn't do that. All right, so it doesn't really, I mean, it's a nitpicky thing that's not that big a deal. All right, now the important things when you're doing algebra with I, treat it like an X. So I times I is I squared. So there's nothing there that should be any different because we didn't always have X when we're doing stuff. This is the part that's a pain in the butt with the I's, okay? Because I squared isn't just a variable, it's a number and it has a thing, all right? I is the square root of -1. So that means when we have I to the second and I to the third and I to the fourth, we can actually figure out what those things are, all right? And we can actually use them. So there are these three things to remember right here, all right? I squared is -1, I to the third is negative I, and I to the fourth is 1. Now there's a reason that those things happen. It's not incredibly complicated. I'm going to show you one example here, all right, and then I can show you the rest if you're interested, but you're probably better off just remembering those three things, all right? It's algebra, so that's kind of how algebra works. You got things to remember. So the reason that I squared is equal to -1, it's not just a made up thing, all right? I is the square root of -1. So that means that I times I is square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And if you remember, anytime we do like square root of 2 times square root of 2, you get 2, whatever's underneath the radical. Because when you square something, which is what's happening, the squared and the square root cancel each other out. So square root of -1 times square root of -1 would give me -1. All right, that's why I squared is equal to -1. All the rest of them work like that. All right, so you can explain I to the third the same way, and you can explain I to the fourth the same way. All right, so when we do this, if we end up with 2I squared minus 4I plus 7, we would replace this I squared with a -1, and it would become 2 times -1 minus 4I plus 7, and then we would play around with it, combine like terms so that we ended up with A plus BI. Okay, you should never have more than 2 terms in one of these answers. All right, this is weird and it takes a little bit of practice, so take your time and go through and spend some time with each of these problems.